We began our series by discussing the importance of a commitment to the joyful mind, the relaxed, happy mind. That this is the foundation of practice in the Buddhist world. Nagarjuna expresses this in verses introducing many of his different texts, such as the Suraleka, the letter to a king, and also his staircase aspiration, which is memorized by many Tibetans as part of their daily practice. And in our second episode, Lamala Tensul, relying effectively upon the qualified master, qualified teacher, qualified lama. And then we come to the third point listed in many Tibetan texts, which is Chuamitakpa, contemplation of death and impermanence. So death and impermanence, and a little bit of a touchy subject, because people can get a little bit, people can get a little bit sort of anxious around the idea of death and impermanence. And I think in modern society, we try to hide from the idea as much as possible. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who popularized hospice work and the importance of addressing the mortality issue in the modern secular world, called it the last taboo. Previous taboos, two big ones, had been talking in public about sex and talking in public about mortality. And the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s lifted the lid off the first of those. But mortality, death, and dying remained something of a taboo. In the Buddhist world, we say it's very important to contemplate death and impermanence 3 times a day in order to keep your life focused in the morning, mid-afternoon, and early evening. If we don't, we easily let the moments and hours and days of our lives slip by slowly in superficiality. If someone has an hour left to live, they make great effort to use that hour meaningfully. If they have a week or a month left to live, the same. They think, what is essential? What is the most important to do with my last hours or my last days? And various ways of contemplating death and dying. The great Pabanka Rinpoche, Dechen Yingpo, and his Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand, one of the great classics of modern Tibetan literature, mentions 2 main techniques, and one is sutra, one is tantra. One is kind of open teaching of Buddha, and one is a little bit more of a discrete teaching to accomplished yogis, you could say, or higher peoples already developed in meditation. And the sutra technique is taken from the Kadampa tradition and practiced in all schools of Tibetan tradition, in all schools of Tibetan Buddhism, I guess you would say. Often known as the 3-point or the 9-round meditation. And the 3 points being sitting down and just acknowledging that the inevitability of death. Until now, all beings have died, and doesn't seem to be much change in that situation. We may prolong our life for a few years with medicines and technology, but our mortality, our time clock is ticking, 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 ticking. And the second point being the uncertainty of time. We might think we have another 10 years or 20 years or 30 years or 40 years or 50 years. But some people die in the womb, some die coming out of the womb, some die in childhood, some in infancy, some in their teens, some in their 20s, some in their 30s, some in their 40s. There is no fixed lifespan with humans. The seventh Dalai Lama wrote in a poem, "A young man with teeth for the future." It means kind of excited, looking forward to excitedly chewing on future days, weeks, months, and years. A young man with teeth for the future died this morning. And then he goes on to say how this just shows the uncertainty. I had a friend in America who was a bit of a hypochondriac. He didn't want to leave the States, always afraid he'd catch some illness or have some accident. He always stuck close to home, hoping that this would keep him alive along into his old age. Very wealthy man. And he went to the dentist one day for a routine checkup and had a little bit of so-called laughing gas. Got out of the dentist chair, took a couple of steps, got a little bit giddy from the laughing gas, which is used in many dentists' offices, fell over, hit his head, went into a coma, and died a few days later. The first Dalai Lama writes in his Lojong commentary, I did a book on it in English called Training the Mind in the Great Way, writes that no matter how rich we are, we can't bribe the Lord of Death. No matter how powerful we are, or a king or a great politician, a president or whatever, we can't intimidate the Lord of Death. And no matter how religious we are, we can't propitiate the Lord of Death. That the Lord of Death certainly comes, and comes unannounced. And the third point is, when we die, what do we leave behind? Well, we leave behind this body, which we've cherished since the time of our birth. We leave behind all friends and relatives, and we leave behind all possessions. So if anything goes on, it's just something to do with the spirit, something to do with the soul, something to do with the santana, the stream of consciousness. So in the sutra method, these three key points, we sit down and just put the mind on them. Often we think of mindfulness meditation as just watching the breath and watching the flow of thoughts, and sort of doing a kind of getting to know yourself, your inner life kind of practice. But it's much more than that. Mindfulness also includes mindfulness of specific dharmas, specific reality factors that we tend to overlook, and overlooking them tend to put ourselves in jeopardy. For instance, if you're traveling in a group and one in the group is an assassin and he's hired to eliminate someone in the group, and just not being aware of that assassin doesn't help. being aware of the assassin helps you protect yourself against that assassin, or if someone else is on his list, protect that person. So Dharma, recollection of Dharma or mindfulness of Dharma, in this case means putting the mind on a specific reality factor. In this case, death and impermanence. Impermanence in the context of our own life. It's not impermanence of all things. I'm not contemplating how a rock is always changing subtly, or icebergs are melting, or the clouds are drifting across the sky, or relationships change. It's not that kind of awareness here, although there are practices along those lines in the Buddhist world, but it's specifically the impermanence of your life, the impermanence of your body, and how your body is aging moment to moment. A few weeks ago, just flipping around on the internet on a project I was working on. In it, the fellow says, I can't remember who it was, but if you think the death is somewhere down the line, actually, you should notice death is already with you, in the sense that however old you are, that's how much of your life has already been eaten by the Lord of Death. So then these three contemplations, certainty of death, uncertainty of time, and when we go, we don't take body, we don't take friends or relatives, we don't take any power or position or anything like that. As the first Dalai Lama puts it in his Lojong text, the king leaves behind his kingdom, a beggar leaves behind his begging bowl and his walking stick. Contemplating the first of those three, putting the mind on the first of those three, reminds us to look to essentials. Death is certain, so don't get hung up or distracted by superficialities. The time of death is uncertain, and as a result, don't procrastinate with essentials. And thirdly, at the time of death, we don't get to take the body, we don't get to take family, friends, we don't get to take secular power or worldly possessions. So look to the more portable treasures, the treasures of the spirit. So all traditions of Tibetan Buddhism recommend doing this practice after stabilizing the happy mind. So we're all going to die, no question. When? Who knows? But while we're alive, stabilize the happy mind and try to deepen the happy mind and give rise to the Enlightenment mind, and in particular, cultivate or collect the portable treasures, the treasures of the spirit. In Kagyu, this is known as one of the Lodak Namshi, the 4 ways of turning the mind. In particular, it turns the mind from superficiality toward matters of the spirit, turns the mind away from just indulgence and diversion toward focused awareness on the quintessential. Good luck with it. 항해하니 흐른 산등 흩뜨러
tapçılasını mırrın golliğos mellili tinkin tellili tinkin beynimi gittiği için yürüdü dülzite ittiri terihin ugum borlu hıngaydın uttagi min